Hello there. In this week's Data Radio Show, we're taking a little bit of a world tour to give you a pretty high level overview of what the laws are around data governance around the world. So, I guess pack your bags, let's go for a quick trip. Welcome to this week's episode of the Data Radio Show. Hey, welcome to this week's episode of the Data Radio Show. I wanted to do something a little bit different this week. You see, a couple of weeks ago, I was a guest on a podcast that deals with things like New Zealand laws that are coming through our parliament here. And one of the law changes that's being implemented is around personal data and data management and governance. And a lot of people were asking questions around what that actually means and why we're updating our laws. And it got me thinking that there's actually a whole bunch of people out there who don't necessarily realize just how, widespread data governance rules are, because there's different rules for different parts of the world. And so I figured this week I might use this as an opportunity to do a bit of a high-level look at some of the different laws in place around data governance from all over the world. If you're somebody who's just starting out on a journey looking at a career in this field, it's the kind of information that will help you kind of get a picture of what's going on. If you work in this field, you should know this stuff already, but you're more than welcome to watch and try and work out what's changed in my background since the last episode. Has something changed? Is there something different there? Or if you're listening to this as a podcast, just, getting confused at what I'm saying about the background because you clearly can't see it. That's the risk of podcasts, I guess. So, buckle in. We're going to go do a bit of a world tour. We're going to head to Europe shortly, but before then, there's a couple of little caveats when it comes to places around the world that might not necessarily have the most up-to-date data governance laws. So let's go check them out. Around the world, there are a lot of different data regulation rules in place. So it's really important to know some of the areas that might be lacking, because there are areas that are still running to play catch-up. Any kind of data law is always playing catch-up with technology and how the world works with things. It's just, unfortunately, the nature of how legislation tends to work. So there's a number of reasons why you might come across an area, for example, that doesn't necessarily have the robust governance rules in place that you're kind of expecting. Like developing countries. Some developing countries don't necessarily have that law in place because of other factors like limited resources or competing priorities, or even a lack of awareness around the importance of data privacy and protection. There are some regions even within countries that could be problematic as well. You get some countries which have established data governance laws for the whole country, but regionally it's a little bit different. The United States is the perfect example of this, and we'll go into that a little bit later. There may be regions and jurisdictions within a country as well where enforcement is weaker or where specific data protection regulations are lacking. There's also rules around things like international waters and territories. Certain international waters and territories like offshore oil rigs or uninhabited islands might not necessarily fall into the jurisdiction of any specific country's data governance laws. It's a bit like back in the day when they had videotape with rules around where you could play this on oil rigs. Very similar sort of concept, to be honest. There's also issues around emerging technologies in virtual spaces. The regulation of data governance in emerging technologies in virtual environments and digital platforms can sometimes be really challenging just due to the rapid pace of change that comes with these. Technological innovation on a global scale is a really difficult thing to legislate against, so it becomes a little bit more tricky. And then finally, there's something called special administrative regions. Now, these are some special regions or territories that might have their own legal systems and may not be subject to the data governance laws of surrounding countries or regions. Somewhere like Puerto Rico, for example, which is a territory, or Guam, which is a territory of the United States, can have different laws in place that aren't necessarily the ones that are used within the United States itself. So now that we've got the tricky, awkward cousins out of the way who are kind of running to play catch-up, let's have a little look at the doyen, the jewel of the crown when it comes to data governance laws. Let's go and have a look at Europe. So when it comes to Europe, there's actually 4 different laws that really come into play here, because Europe is obviously fairly large, but one of the kids threw a tantrum and ran away not that long ago. So let's go through some of the laws that they've got in place there. The laws in Europe are really designed to protect individuals' privacy and regulate the processing of personal data. The most prominent and comprehensive of these is the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, which came into effect in 2018. So let's go through that one first. You see, the GDPR is a regulation by the European Union, or EU, that governs the protection of personal data of individuals within the EU and within the European Economic Area, or EEA. It doesn't just apply to organizations within Europe, though. It applies to any organization that's accessing or processing personal data of individuals who are within the EU. The key principles of GDPR include data minimization, purpose limitation, accuracy, storage limitation, integrity, and confidentiality. The regulation imposes really strict requirements on obtaining consent for data processing, data breach notifications, and data transfers outside of the EU and EEA. It grants individuals several rights, such as the right to access, rectify information, erase information, restrict of processing, data portability, and the right to object to processing. Non-compliance with the GDPR actually comes with some really hefty fines, up to €20 million or 4% of the annual global turnover of the previous financial year, whichever one is higher. The next big one to know about Europe is called the ePrivacy Directive. The ePrivacy Directive is also known as the Cookie Law. It governs the privacy and confidentiality of electronic communications. It regulates the use of cookies and other similar tracking technologies like pixels, and requires obtaining users' consent before storing or accessing information on their devices. The directive applies to all businesses operating in the EU that use electronic communication services or engage in electronic marketing activities. Next up, you have something called the DPA, or Data Protection Directive. Each EU member state has its own DPA, or Data Protection Authority, related to data protection violations. These laws and regulations are aimed to harmonise data protection standards across the EU and ensure the privacy and rights of individuals, and promote the secure and lawful processing of personal data by organisations. They've had a significant impact on how businesses collect, store and use personal data, requiring them to implement robust data protection measures and procedures. There's one other piece of European legislation that people should probably be aware of because of, that tantrum I mentioned earlier, Brexit. Following Brexit, the UK actually enacted its own data protection legislation, which pretty much just incorporates GDPR into the UK law. They also have the Data Protection Act of 2018, which supplements GDPR and includes provisions specific to the United Kingdom context. Right, let's head to the United States now, because this is a really interesting place for a number of reasons. Like the fact that you've got federal laws that will cover everybody, but you've also got individual state laws, which mean you can get some variations from place to place. Some state laws are much better than others, and some states are running to catch up in a whole bunch of different ways if you listen to the news. But when it comes to data governance laws, there's a few that you need to be aware of, like HIPPA. HIPPA is actually the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. It's a federal law that sets the standards for protection of sensitive patient information, or PHI. It applies to covered entities such as healthcare providers, health plans, and healthcare clearinghouses. And any country that has healthcare clearinghouses is a very scary place, and as well as all of these organizations' business associates. The HIPAA regulations include requirements for secure handling of PHI, patient privacy rights, breach notifications, and enforcement mechanisms. Another big law in the United States you need to be aware of is something called the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, or GLBA. This is a federal law that regulates the way financial institutions handle the personal information of individuals. So this is a big deal because it includes organizations like banks and shareholders, stock holding companies, pretty much anything that has anything to do with finances. So it's really important to kind of get your head around this one. This act requires financial institutions to disclose privacy policies and practices regarding the collection and sharing of consumers' personal information. The GLBA also imposes data security requirements and mandates the protection of consumers' non-public personal information. The US federal government also has something called the Children Online Privacy Protection Act, or COPPA. COPPA is a federal law that protects the online privacy of children under the age of 13. It requires operators of websites and online services directed at children or that collect personal information from children to obtain verifiable parental consent before collecting, using or disclosing personal information from children. Finally, in terms of federal laws, there's the Federal Trade Commission Act, or FTC Act. The FTC Act empowers Federal Trade Commission, or the FTC, to protect consumers from unfair and deceptive practices related to commerce. The FTC has the authority over privacy and data security matters and can take enforcement actions against companies that engage in unfair or deceptive practices related to the handling of consumer data. When you're in the United States, you're dealing with 50 individual states who all have their own variations of data governance rules around different areas. But one of the ones that stands out just because of how comprehensive it is something called the CCPA, or the California Consumer Privacy Act. While this isn't a federal law, the CCPA is a significant state-level privacy law in California that grants consumers certain rights regarding their personal information. It requires business to meet certain criteria to disclose their data collection and sharing practices, provide consumers with the right to opt out of the sale of their personal information, and allow consumers to access and delete their personal information. The CCPA applies to businesses that operate in California and meet certain revenue or data processing thresholds regardless of where they're headquartered if they operate within the state. So it very much is a standalone in that respect, a little bit like what we saw with GDPR in the EU. One of the countries that's currently doing a lot of work around data privacy laws and data governance laws is Australia. At the moment, there's, I think, 6 laws in place there that sort of impact how data governance works. So let's have a quick run through those, because it's kind of fascinating to see some of the ages of these and the fact that they're being updated, like in the process of it now, to see how technology and the world and society in general have changed their attitude towards data governance. Right, first up is the 1988 Privacy Act. The Privacy Act is primary federal legislation that governs the handling of personal information in Australia. It regulates the handling of personal information by both the Australian government and agencies and the private sector organisations with an annual turnover above a certain amount of money. The Privacy Act includes the Australian Privacy Principles, or APPs, which set out standards for the collection, use, disclosure and storage of personal information. Added into the mix with the Privacy Act is something called the Notifiable Data Breaches Scheme, or NDB scheme. Basically, this means that organisations are required by the Privacy Act now to notify an individual who's been affected by eligible data breaches that are likely to result in serious harm. Organisations are also required to report eligible data breaches to the Office of the Australian Information Commissioner, the OAIC. God, there's so many acronyms in this episode. In 2012, they also introduced something called the MyHealthcare Act. The legislation establishes the framework for MyHealth record systems, which allows individuals to access and manage their health information electronically. It outlines the privacy and security measures that must be adhered to by the healthcare providers in the country and other entities that participate in the MyHealthcare record system. One of the oldest laws that you'll come across in any of this high-level talk is actually something called the Telecommunications Act from 1979. This is an act that regulates the interception of communications and access to stored communication data by enforcement agencies in particular. And it was very much written in a time before the internet was even a thing. It's very much built around the idea of communicating and intercepting things like radio and phone calls, like landline phone calls. So it's kind of been adapted to fit for purpose in a modern world. It includes provisions related to the lawful interception of telecommunications and the protection of individuals' privacy rights. Now, a little bit like America, Australia actually has states as well, although nowhere near as many and hardly any as crazy as some of those southern states that we hear so much about in the news over here. One of the things that's really important to know about Australian law is that there are local state laws around data governance as well. These are in addition to the federal Australian laws, and territories basically set up their own rules around privacy and data protection legislation that applies to specific sectors or activities. And an example of that is something like the Victorian Privacy and Data Protection Act, which governs specifically privacy and data protection within Victoria, Australia. And finally, there's something called the GDPR, which you may recall we mentioned before because that's the European Union law. But this is an Australian law that's very much specifically been put in place to ensure that Australians meet the requirements that are put in place under that European law. It means that the GDPR has implications to Australian businesses that handle personal data of individuals from within the EU. And Australian organisations that fall within the scope of GDPR have to ensure compliance with its requirements regarding processing and protection of personal data. It's pretty much the rundown on Australia's laws. When it comes to data governance, Australia is running to play catch up a little bit with the rest of the world. And I mean, if they'd been really, really proactive with how they govern data, they would have been able to find the evidence that they didn't invent Pavlova. That came from New Zealand, but, well, I guess that's what happens when you need to play catch up with your data governance. Anyway, let's jump into another part of the world. Let's do some quick trips around parts of Asia and other parts of the world that have some significant policy points in place around data governance, like China's Personal Information Protection Law, or PIPL. It's very fun to say, by the way. Give it a try. PIPL. This is China's privacy law that essentially matches the GDPR. It came into effect in 2021, and it's one of the most comprehensive data policy regulations anywhere in the world. It regulates the processing of personal information by both public and private sector entities and imposes obligations similar to those actually found in the GDPR, such as obtaining consent, data minimization, and data subject rights. In China, this is kind of a big issue because there's a lot of centralized technology that involves data governance. They have things like a central digital currency or ID or communication methods. So the kind of rules that are put in place for an area like Europe actually apply really nicely to an area like China, where they need to maintain a level of communication and openness with what they're doing, but have their own very specific ways of doing things. One of the other areas that's got some fascinating rules is Singapore. They have something called the PDPA. It's their main data protection law, and it governs the collection and use and disclosure of personal data by organizations that are based in Singapore. It establishes data protection obligations for organizations and provides individuals with rights over their personal data. Then there's also the Personal Information Protection and Electronic Documents Act from Canada, or PIPPA. My God, I love these acronyms. PIPPA is Canada's federal privacy law, and it governs the collection, use, and disclosure of personal information by the private sector, mostly engaged in commercial activities. It sets out principles for the fair handling of personal information and gives individuals the right to access their personal information that is held by these organizations. In Brazil, you'll find the General Data Protection Law, or LGPD. This is their comprehensive data protection law, and it's basically modeled after GDPR, which regulates the processing of personal data within Brazil. It applies again to both public and private sector organizations and grants individuals rights over their personal data. And then you have somewhere like South Korea, which has the Personal Data Protection Act, or PDPA. The PDPA in South Korea governs the processing of personal data, and again, this is by both public and private sector entities. It includes provisions on the collection, use, and transfer of personal data, as well as imposing obligations on data controllers to protect individual rights. So there's quite a few things that are showing up all over the world that allows users to ensure that they've got those protections in place to be able to access their data, to manage their data properly, and manage it in ways that make sure that everybody's informed with what's going on. There are countries like the one I'm in at the moment in New Zealand where those laws are running to play catch up a little bit. And as I said at the beginning of this, those are looking at being changed. Our laws are looking at being brought into line with everybody else, and this is going to constantly evolve as we see changes in the way that something like generative AI works and the way that our different structures work around building data management platforms. There's a lot to take on board. So I'm going to stop there because I'm actually starting to lose my voice from all of this. But one of the things that you really need to ask yourself when it comes to what you've heard today is, why is data governance so important? It's kind of a fundamental question that basically allows us to understand the rationale behind why we have data governance rules in place. It's big, and it's a core question that anybody looking at going into the industry really needs to be looking into. Look, that's it for today's episode. Don't forget to head over to the Data Vault Innovators community. Go sign up there for free. Check out everything that's going on and join the conversation. I hope this has been an educational and informative video for you. Now, I need to go and take a cup of tea with some lemon to get my throat back. Until next week, have a fantastic time, and may the force be with you.